Imagine holding a single document possessing the destructive force to obliterate the lifeline of a collapsing nation. You stand in the dimly lit archives of a major news syndicate, staring at undeniable proof that the savior of your country, the man, poised to rescue millions from absolute ruin, built his empire on deliberate, cold-blooded murder. This is a ticking time bomb resting squarely in your hands. If you publish the truth, you ignite a political firestorm that will plunge the nation into irreversible chaos, starvation, and riots. Yet, if you bury the document, you become a silent accomplice to a monster, crowning a ruthless architect of suffering as the ultimate leader. What is the actual price of a secret when the currency is human survival? Now, twist the blade deeper into your own conscience. The victim of that long-forgotten crime, the collateral damage swept under the rug to pave the way for this tyrant's ascent, was not a nameless stranger. The casualty was your own father. He was framed, financially destroyed, and driven to an early grave by the exact man now smiling on every television screen, promising salvation to the masses. The absolute power to exact vengeance, to tear down the untouchable giant who destroyed your family, is finally yours. But this vengeance requires you to execute the hopes of millions of desperate citizens who genuinely depend on his unparalleled influence to survive the upcoming winter. You must weigh the ghost of your father against the pulse of an entire society. Welcome back to the Moral Pivot, the space where we dissect the agonizing crossroads of human conviction and consequence, tearing away the comfortable illusions of right and wrong. We push you into the minds of those forced to navigate the darkest corners of ethical paradoxes, challenging you to question what you would genuinely sacrifice when the ultimate crisis demands an impossible choice. Before we plunge into the unraveling psyche of our investigative journalist, Evelyn Vance, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Your support fuels our deep dives into these complex psychological battlegrounds, allowing us to continue bringing you high-stakes narratives that linger in your mind long after the screen fades to black. We also want to know exactly where our community of deep thinkers is tuning in from today. Drop a comment down below telling us your country and city, and let us know right off the bat. Would you burn down a corrupt savior if it meant setting your own country on fire? Prepare yourselves, because the threshold of morality is about to shatter. The fluorescent lights of the Chronicle hummed with a sterile, unforgiving buzz, casting long shadows across Evelyn Vance's cluttered desk. It was 3 a.m., a time reserved exclusively for the desperate and the obsessed. Cold coffee stained the rims of 3 different mugs, mirroring the permanent, bruise-like exhaustion etched beneath her dark brown eyes. She was sifting through encrypted financial ledgers, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a punishing rhythm, hunting for a fracture in an otherwise impenetrable fortress of lies. Outside the reinforced glass of her office, the city was bleeding. Economic arteries had severed months ago, leaving millions drowning in hyperinflation and crippling unemployment. The only tourniquet keeping the nation from complete collapse was Arthur Sterling. His face dominated every billboard, a 60-year-old titan of industry radiating calculated charisma and ruthless efficiency. He wasn't just running for the highest office. He was ascending to a throne built on the panicked prayers of a starving populace. But Evelyn possessed a terrifying gift. She could smell the rot beneath the expensive cologne. Sterling's narrative was too flawless, his ascent to clean. Predators of his magnitude always left a trail of carcasses, no matter how deeply they buried the bones. For 6 grueling months, she had been mapping the subterranean roots of his empire, tracing offshore accounts and phantom corporations that vanished into bureaucratic black holes. Marcus Thorne, her editor, materialized in the doorway, the sharp scent of nicotine trailing behind him like a ghost. His tie hung loosely round his neck, and his face wore the battered landscape of a man who had compromised his ideals one too many times. Leaning against the doorframe, he warned Evelyn that dismantling the nation's only life raft was a journalistic suicide mission. He argued with heavy, exhausted breath that the public didn't want transparency right now. They craved a savior, even a corrupt one. Evelyn barely acknowledged his presence, her gaze locked on the flickering monitor. She had just breached a secondary archive protecting a defunct holding company dating back 25 years. It was a microscopic anomaly, a digital fossil buried beneath decades of aggressive corporate restructuring. The documents revealed that this holding company had orchestrated the hostile takeover and immediate liquidation of a thriving mid-sized industrial plant, stripping its assets to anonymously inflate Sterling's initial political capital. As the unredacted files flooded her screen, the temperature in the newsroom seemed to plummet. The ledgers detailed a systematic sabotage, fabricated debts, manipulated union disputes, and a carefully constructed scapegoat chosen to bear the legal and public brunt of the catastrophic collapse. Sterling hadn't simply bought a competitor. He had engineered a financial slaughter, ruining hundreds of families to extract the marrow he needed to build his empire. Then, her eyes locked onto the signature at the bottom of the ruined plant's final liquidation decree. It belonged to the designated scapegoat, the manager who had been legally framed for the embezzlement, publicly disgraced and driven to hang himself in a suffocating, oil-stained garage just 2 days later. The name glaring back at her from the glowing monitor was Thomas Vance. The detached political investigation instantly morphed into a blood-soaked vendetta. The revelation hit Evelyn with the blunt force of a physical blow, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. The digital glow of her father's signature, a hurried, frantic scrawl so vastly different from his usual meticulous handwriting, seemed to burn through the monitor and sear itself into her retinas. For 25 years, she had carried the crushing weight of his suicide, believing it was the tragic consequence of a man who simply could not withstand the pressures of corporate failure. Now, she stared at the irrefutable proof that his death was not a tragedy. It was a calculated execution orchestrated from a polished boardroom. Memories violently resurrected themselves, breaking through the dam of her suppressed grief. She remembered Thomas Vance not as the disgraced executive the media painted, but as a man whose hands smelled of machine oil and whose pockets always held a piece of peppermint candy. He was a man who believed in a handshake, utterly blind to the predatory machinery Arthur Sterling had mobilized against him. Sterling had needed a corpse to bury his financial anomalies, and Thomas had been the perfect, trusting candidate. Marcus, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room, stubbed out his cigarette and stepped fully into Evelyn's office. He read the screen over her trembling shoulder, his seasoned eyes scanning the liquidation decree and the offshore transfers. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the cramped space as the editor connected the dots. The lines on his face deepened into trenches, realizing that his best investigative reporter had just stumbled into a blood feud masquerading as political journalism. Evelyn's voice, when she finally spoke, was a lethal whisper devoid of its usual journalistic detachment. She demanded immediate publication, insisting they bypass the standard legal review to strike Sterling before his campaign could intercept the leak. She possessed the smoking gun that proved the prospective savior of the nation was a parasite who fed on the destruction of honest men. It was the ultimate scoop, the story that would define her career and avenge a quarter-century of stolen justice. But Marcus slammed his hand onto the desk, rattling the cold coffee mugs. He didn't offer comfort. He offered the brutal, pragmatic calculus of reality. He pointed out the reinforced glass window toward the shivering, destitute city below. If they dismantled sterling now, weeks before the election, the incumbent regime, a dictatorship actively bleeding the populace dry, would retain power by default. The fragile economic recovery plan Sterling had promised would evaporate overnight. The editor forced Evelyn to look at the broader, terrifying canvas. Exposing Sterling's original sin would vindicate Thomas Vance, but it would concurrently doom millions of families to the exact same financial slaughter her father had endured. The food banks were empty, the hospitals lacked basic supplies, and Sterling's aggressive, albeit corrupt, restructuring was the only viable strategy keeping the nation from descending into a full-scale civil war. A sickening realization began to coil in Evelyn's stomach. She was holding a detonator. Pressing the button would obliterate the monster who destroyed her family, fulfilling a lifelong, hollow ache for retribution. Yet, the blast radius of that vengeance would incinerate the working-class people who looked exactly like her father. People who were currently banking their survival on Sterling's victory. Refusing to let the story die in the shadows of a newsroom, Evelyn pulled a fragmented, encrypted drive from her pocket and transferred the phantom ledgers. She realized that publishing the article from behind a desk was a coward's maneuver. If she was going to execute Arthur Sterling or spare him for the sake of the nation, she needed to look the architect of her father's demise in the eye. Penetrating Arthur Sterling's inner sanctum required Evelyn to leverage every ounce of her press credentials and professional audacity. She bypassed the glittering ballroom of his premier campaign fundraiser, slipping past private security details and navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the luxury hotel. She finally cornered him in a soundproofed VIP suite, far removed from the desperate, adoration-starved crowds chanting his name on the streets below. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette of immaculate tailoring and terrifying composure, watching the fractured city skyline as if he already owned the ruins. Sterling didn't flinch when the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her. He slowly turned, his piercing blue eyes evaluating her with the clinical precision of a surgeon inspecting a potential complication. He recognized her instantly, acknowledging the Chronicle's top investigative hound, but his smile remained perfectly calibrated, charming, impenetrable, and entirely devoid of warmth. He offered her a drink, dismissing her intrusion as merely an aggressive interview tactic from a hungry journalist. Evelyn ignored the pleasantries, closing the distance between them. She reached into her trench coat and slammed a single, printed folder onto the glass coffee table, separating them. She didn't offer a dramatic monologue or a righteous declaration of war. She simply flipped open the cover, exposing the 25-year-old liquidation decree, the offshore routing numbers, and the frantic forged signature of Thomas Vance. The ghost of her father now lay under the harsh, modern spotlights of Sterling's suite. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn watched Sterling's face closely, hunting for a micro-expression of panic, a twitch of guilt, or even the immediate instinct to call his security detail. Instead, the politician calmly picked up the document, his manicured fingers grazing the ink that had signed away her father's life. His expression didn't shatter. It merely shifted from manufactured charm to a chilling, predatory stillness. He remembered the name perfectly. Sterling didn't deny the forgery, nor did he attempt to spin a web of plausible deniability. He tossed the folder back onto the table and looked Evelyn dead in the eyes, stripping away the polished facade of the savior to reveal the ruthless architect underneath. He openly admitted that destroying Thomas Vance was a necessary, calculated maneuver, a brutal extraction of capital required to launch the financial empire that now stood as the only pillar keeping the national economy from complete disintegration. He stepped closer, invading her space, his voice dropping to a gravelly hypnotic register. He forced Evelyn to look out the window at the sprawling, darkened neighborhoods where rolling blackouts left millions freezing in their homes. He painted a brutal picture of the immediate future. If she published those ledgers, the current tyrannical regime would sweep the election, the relief funds would vanish into corrupt pockets, and the subsequent riots would burn the city to the ground within a week. Sterling weaponized her own ethical compass, framing his past crime not as a sin, but as a foundational sacrifice. He argued that the crushing of one factory manager 25 years ago was the grim price paid to acquire the power necessary to feed 10 million starving citizens today. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was demanding her complicity in the name of the greater good. The psychological warfare paralyzed Evelyn. She had come prepared to execute a monster, armed with undeniable truth. But Sterling had expertly reversed the executioner's blade. He presented a terrifying mathematical equation of human lives, positioning her father's memory against the survival of a collapsing nation. If she pulled the trigger on the article, she wouldn't just be a journalist uncovering the truth. She would become the catalyst for mass starvation, escaping the suffocating opulence of Arthur Sterling's suite. Evelyn stumbled out into the freezing, rain-slicked streets of the capital. The biting wind felt like shattered glass against her face, a brutal contrast to the climate-controlled sanctuary of the man who had just confessed to destroying her family. She walked aimlessly through the decaying downtown blocks, watching hollow-eyed citizens huddled around burning trash barrels. These were the very people Sterling claimed to be saving, the desperate collateral damage he was using as a human shield against her journalistic integrity. The Chronicle's newsroom felt like a fluorescent purgatory when she finally pushed through the revolving glass doors at dawn. The chaotic symphony of ringing phones and clacking keyboards had not yet begun. The floor was a graveyard of empty desks and discarded coffee cups. Marcus Thorne was exactly where she had left him, slumped in his chair, staring at the muted television broadcasts of food riots escalating in the southern districts. He didn't ask her what Sterling had said. The pale, haunted hollows of her cheeks delivered the entire agonizing summary. Evelyn sat at her terminal, the finalized expose glowing violently against the dim ambient light. The headline was a loaded weapon, painstakingly crafted to detonate Sterling's carefully constructed mythology. Attached to the draft were the higher resolution scans of the offshore ledgers and her father's forged signature. Her index finger hovered agonizingly over the publish key. A mere fraction of an ounce of pressure separated her from fulfilling a lifelong vendetta and plunging an already bleeding nation into a fatal hemorrhage. The silence in the newsroom became a physical weight pressing against her ribcage. Marcus slowly stood up, walked over to her desk, and placed a worn silver lighter beside her keyboard. It was a silent, devastating gesture of absolute surrender. He was telling her that he would not stop her, nor would he absolve her. The ethical burden belonged entirely to her now. She was no longer just reporting the news, she was dictating the survival of millions. A phantom scent of machine oil and peppermint candy suddenly flooded her senses. An involuntary hallucination triggered by extreme psychological exhaustion. Thomas Vance materialized in the periphery of her mind, a man who possessed an unwavering, almost naive belief in fundamental fairness. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, fighting a wave of nausea. She tried to convince herself that pulling the trigger was an act of ultimate justice, a necessary purification of a corrupt system. But the predator's logic had infected her. If she published a piece, the incumbent dictator would weaponize her article to crush Sterling, securing another decade of starvation and state-sanctioned brutality. She would be handing the executioner a sharpened axe. all to soothe the phantom ache of a father who would have abhorred the idea of millions suffering to avenge his ruined reputation. Yet, the alternative was equally abhorrent. Deleting the draft meant burying Thomas Vance in an unmarked grave of forgotten history forever. It meant crossing the invisible, sacred boundary of her profession, mutating from a guardian of truth into an active co-conspirator of a murderer. If she swallowed this secret, the rot of Sterling's original sin would forever corrupt whatever salvation he managed to provide the country. The cursor on the screen blinked rhythmically, a digital pulse mocking her paralysis. Outside, the wail of police sirens pierced the dawn, a chilling prelude to the violence that awaited the city. Evelyn stared at the glowing terminal, the boundaries between right and wrong dissolving into a terrifying, indistinct grey. The guillotine was raised, the rope was in her hands, and the entire nation was kneeling on the block. Dawn breached the reinforced windows of the Chronicle, casting a pale, sickly light over the empty newsroom. Evelyn stared at the flashing cursor at the end of her manuscript, her eyes burning from the blinding white glare of the monitor. The phantom scent of peppermint candy evaporated, replaced entirely by the sterile, unforgiving smell of ozone and stale coffee. The chaotic machinery of the city was waking up, entirely unaware that its survival hung on the trembling index finger of a single exhausted journalist. She looked at the dual monitors flanking her primary screen. On the left, the forged signature of Thomas Vance, a silent scream frozen in digital ink. On the right, a live aerial broadcast of the southern districts, showing a sprawling, shivering breadline stretching for blocks under the freezing rain. Evelyn realized with sickening clarity that pure, unadulterated justice was a luxury a starving nation could no longer afford. To act as the executioner of Arthur Sterling meant actively volunteering to be the butcher of the working class. The transition from journalist to accomplice did not happen with a dramatic epiphany. It happened with a cold, mechanical surrender. Evelyn dragged her mouse across the screen, highlighting the entirety of the explosive explos. This document was the culmination of 6 agonizing months of investigative warfare and 25 years of deeply buried trauma. Her finger hovered over the delete key. It felt infinitely heavier than a trigger. The keystroke echoed like a muffled gunshot in the silent room. The screen instantly purged the text, wiping away Thomas Vance's long-awaited vindication in a single, irreversible digital breath. But erasing the draft wasn't enough to secure the nation's fragile future. Evelyn mechanically opened the root directories of her encrypted servers, initiating a military-grade data wipe. She watched the progress bar slowly consume the offshore ledgers, the phantom holding companies, and every trace of Sterling's original sin. She was burning down the only bridge to her father's redemption. Marcus Thorne watched the digital fire from across the aisle. He slowly walked over, picking up the physical, printed folder Evelyn had brought back from Sterling's hotel suite. Without speaking a single word, the seasoned editor fed the heavy parchment documents into the industrial shredder beside her desk. The grinding teeth of the machine devoured the forged signature, turning the ultimate proof of a murder into meaningless, thin strips of white confetti. They were sanitizing history. Marcus placed a heavy, calloused hand on Evelyn's shoulder. He didn't offer a celebratory smile or a hollow speech about journalistic sacrifice. "You just bought them time," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own compromised soul. "But you'll pay for it every time you close your eyes." Evelyn didn't respond. The emotional circuitry required to cry had completely burned out, leaving behind a hollow, metallic ache in her chest. She had executed her own innocence to keep the city breathing. Hours later, Evelyn descended the steps of the Chronicle building and stepped into the freezing morning air. The streets were already shifting. Newsstand radios blared with Sterling's voice. A live broadcast of a press conference announcing an emergency influx of foreign aid secured by his campaign. A mother, walking past Evelyn, pulled her coat tighter around her shivering child, a brief look of desperate hope flashing across her tired face as she listened to the broadcast. Evelyn stopped on the pavement, letting the freezing rain soak through her trench coat. The dictator was going to win the election. The markets would stabilize, and the bread lines would slowly dissolve. She had saved them. But as she stood anonymously in the crowd, listening to the roaring applause echoing from the radios, she realized the terrifying finality of her choice. The ghost of Thomas Vance was gone forever, replaced by the permanent, crushing silence of a secret she would carry to her grave. So, where does the compass point when every direction leads straight into the dark? Evelyn Vance deliberately chose the survival of millions over the vindication of her own blood. She swallowed a digital poison pill, destroying the evidence of her father's murder so the rest of a collapsing nation could finally eat. But does that make her a silent hero bearing an unimaginable, agonizing cross? Or did she simply become another corrupted pawn, permanently assimilated into Arthur Sterling's ruthless game of empire building? Now, the crushing burden of the pivot falls directly to you. If you were standing in that freezing, dimly lit newsroom, holding the absolute power to publicly execute a monster, but knowing the blast radius would trigger a catastrophic national famine, what keystroke would you actually choose? Would you hit publish to honor the dead, or delete to save the living? Drop your definitive choice and your raw reasoning in the comments below. If this descent into the darkest gray areas of human conviction challenged your perspective, make sure you are subscribed to The Moral Pivot. We will be waiting for you right here, at the edge of the next impossible crossroads.